The courtroom was supposed to be silent, but that morning it felt alive, charged, waiting like the air before lightning. Then a little girl in a faded blue dress stood up, clutching a stuffed rabbit so worn its ear barely hung on. "Free my dad," she said to the judge, her voice clear and calm, "and I'll heal you." People laughed, some softly, some uncomfortably, but the laughter stopped when the judge's eyes met the girl's. What happened next made believers out of skeptics, and if you stay with me, you'll understand why some moments in life defy everything we think we know about truth, law, and miracles. Tell me if you saw something impossible with your own eyes, would you believe it? It was a gray December morning in Brooklyn, the kind of morning that made the courthouse feel colder than the street outside. Judge Eliza Marlowe wheeled herself into courtroom 4B, the old oak panels creaking, as if even they knew this case would be different. 3 years ago, an accident had taken her ability to walk, and nearly her faith in people. She was known for her sharp rulings, her calm authority, and the quiet sadness behind her smile that only those who paid close attention ever noticed. Across the room sat Rafael Ortiz, 34, a construction foreman turned single father. He was charged with armed robbery, a label that made him look harder than he was. His hands, once steady on steel beams, now shook as he clutched the table. He wasn't a bad man, he was a desperate one. The grainy surveillance footage showed him walking into a neighborhood pharmacy near Flatbush late one night. No mask, no threats, just a trembling hand holding what looked like a weapon, though later everyone would learn it was nothing more than his daughter's pink toy water gun. He left $18 and some change on the counter, grabbed insulin and fever medicine, and ran. Not for money, for love. That love sat in the front row, swinging her small legs under the bench. Lily Ortiz was 5 years old, her blonde curls tied in a ribbon that didn't quite match her dress. Her grandmother had brought her to court hoping the child would stay quiet, but children have a way of knowing when something sacred is happening. She'd watched her father sit in that chair for an hour, and something in her heart, something she didn't have words for, told her she needed to speak. Assistant District Attorney Daniel Pierce stood tall and confident, his navy suit crisp, his tone sharp. "Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence is clear." Mr. Ortiz entered the pharmacy after hours and left with stolen property. Whatever his reasons, the law does not excuse theft. He spoke with the kind of certainty that comes from winning more than losing, and the jurors nodded, almost relieved to have something solid to hold on to. But Rafael's young attorney, Maya Nguyen, looked less certain. This was only her third major case, and her notes were shaking in her hands. "Your Honor," she said softly, "what Mr. Ortiz did wasn't out of greed. His daughter was in crisis. He tried every hospital, every clinic. No one would help because he couldn't pay." She paused, finding courage in the silence. Sometimes the line between right and wrong depends on whether you've ever had to choose between the law and your child's life. Judge Marlowe listened, her green eyes steady but heavy. She'd spent her entire career balancing justice and compassion, but this case scraped against something deeper, something she thought she'd buried the day a drunk driver changed her life forever. Still, the law was the law, and she was about to remind everyone of that when Lily stood up. "Judge Lady," the girl said, her voice slicing through the courtroom buzz like a bell in fog. Her grandmother tried to hush her, but Lily shook her head. "My daddy didn't do anything bad. He just wanted me to breathe." Every word carried the kind of truth that doesn't need translation. Then came the line, the one nobody would ever forget. "Free my dad," she said again, "and I'll heal you." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then someone chuckled, a low, nervous sound. Another joined in. Even Ada Pierce's lips twitched in disbelief. Heal her? It was absurd. This was a courtroom, not Sunday Mass, and miracles didn't happen here. But Judge Marlowe didn't laugh. Her hands froze on the bench, her throat tight. "Sweetheart," she said carefully, "you can't make promises like that. Healing doesn't work that way." Lily tilted her head, studying the judge with eyes that seemed too old for 5. "Yes, it does," she said softly, "when it's for love." Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small wilted daisy. Its petals were brown, its stem bent. She placed it on the table beside her and cupped it between her palms. Nobody spoke. Even the bailiff leaned forward. And then, as the seconds passed, something impossible began to happen. The petals lifted. The color returned. The daisy straightened as if it had just been plucked from the courthouse garden that morning. Gasps broke through the silence. One juror covered her mouth. Another whispered, "Oh my God." The court reporter stopped typing. Ada Pierce muttered, "That's not possible," but his voice shook. Lily just smiled and looked up at the judge. "See," she whispered, "love fixes things when people can't." Judge Marlowe stared at the daisy, alive, bright, fragrant, and felt something crack inside her chest. It wasn't pain. It was the sound of hope waking up after years of sleep. For the first time since her accident, she felt her heart race for a reason that wasn't fear or anger. Somewhere deep down, she wanted to believe the child might be right. That's when she realized the courtroom had changed. The usual tension, the hard edge of accusation and defense had softened. People weren't thinking about guilt anymore. They were thinking about possibility, about what it meant if this little girl with her simple faith could make something dead come alive again. Judge Marlowe took a deep breath, her voice quiet but clear. "Miss Ortiz," she said, "you've certainly given this court something to think about." She should have stopped there. She should have ordered the bailiff to escort Lily back to her seat, but she didn't. Instead, she leaned forward and asked the question that would change both their lives. "What do you mean by heal me?" Lily's eyes sparkled. "I mean," she said, "you'll walk again." And with that, the courtroom fell into the kind of silence that makes people remember where they were. The kind of silence that comes before history changes its mind, before the gavel ever struck wood, before the headlines and the miracle. There were 2 lives quietly unraveling, one behind a judge's bench and the other behind the cracked door of a small apartment in Sunset Park. What happened in that Brooklyn courtroom didn't start there. It began months earlier in moments no one saw, in choices made by people who were simply trying to hold their world together. Judge Eliza Marlowe had once been the rising star of the New York Judicial Circuit. Her rulings were sharp, her compassion fierce, and her ability to balance both had earned her respect in a system often allergic to mercy. But everything changed one rainy evening on the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway. A drunk driver ran a red light. In an instant, Eliza's car spun, the world flipped, and she woke to find her body foreign and unresponsive. She remembered the sirens, the smell of gasoline, the taste of blood, and then the quiet that followed, the kind that lives in hospital rooms where fluorescent lights never sleep. Months of rehab at NYU Langone followed. She fought every inch, refusing pity, refusing the word disabled. She learned how to maneuver her chair through narrow hallways, how to rebuild a life that no longer looked like her own. Her husband didn't stay. He said he wanted to help, but what he really wanted was the woman she used to be, the one who could walk into a room and command it. When he left, he took their wedding photo off the mantel, leaving behind only the frame. By the time Eliza returned to the bench, the courthouse had been retrofitted for accessibility, but no renovation could fix the distance she now felt between herself and the world she once ruled from above. She no longer stood to deliver verdicts. She spoke from seated height, relying on her voice to carry what her body once could. People still rose when she entered, but she felt the irony sting each time. Justice was supposed to be blind, but pity had perfect vision. Every night after court, she wheeled herself to the window of her high-rise apartment overlooking the East River. The lights of the Brooklyn Bridge shimmered like a promise she didn't trust. She watched joggers pass below the rhythm of their strides, a reminder of something she'd lost. Sometimes, when no one was looking, she pressed her palms against her thighs, willing them to move. They never did. That was her private sentence mobility traded for survival, and in the silence of those nights she wondered if maybe God had gone deaf to her kind of prayer. Across the borough, Rafael Ortiz was fighting a different kind of battle. He had worked construction since he was 19, strong, reliable, the guy who volunteered for the jobs nobody wanted. When he fell from a scaffolding on a job site in Queens, he thought it was just a fracture. The X-rays said otherwise. Torn ligaments, nerve damage, and a leg that would never carry weight the same way again. Workers' comp came late and ended early. His company moved on without him. The rent didn't. His mother Rosa tried to help. Her arthritis made it hard for her to climb the stairs to their third-floor apartment, but she still cooked, still prayed over their bills at the kitchen table. God sees the good ones, she said, but the notices in the mailbox suggested otherwise. Rafael tried everything: odd jobs, handyman work, night shifts at the bodega, but his savings drained faster than hope could refill it. He kept smiling for Lily, though, because that's what fathers do. They carry the worry quietly in the space between breaths. Then came the cold spell that changed everything. The heat barely worked, and Lily's asthma returned worse than before. The inhaler was empty, the pharmacy bill overdue. The clinic said to come back with insurance. The emergency room said they couldn't treat another unpaid visit. Rafael sat in their small kitchen at midnight, his daughter wheezing softly in the next room, and stared at the empty bottle of medicine like it was a moral test. He called every friend he had, every cousin, every favor he was owed. Nobody answered. At 11:30 that night, he put on his work boots, kissed Lily's forehead, and whispered, "Daddy's going to fix it." That was the kind of lie a man tells when he's run out of honest ones. Meanwhile, Eliza's mornings were a different kind of endurance. She was up before dawn, her routine mechanical transfer dress, coffee courthouse. The bailiff greeted her at the door with the same careful kindness every day, the kind that reminded her she was being managed, not respected. Still, she did the job. She buried herself in rulings, case law, and the 1,000 tiny decisions that kept the system moving. The cases came and went, assaults, thefts, fraud, but they all felt the same. Broken people colliding with a broken system, each pretending the other was fixable. That winter, she began seeing a new therapist at the hospital, Dr. Sunil Kapoor, who had a way of speaking that made silence feel like part of the conversation. He once told her, "Sometimes, Judge, the hardest verdict to deliver is the one you owe yourself." She didn't respond, but she thought about it for days. He was the first person who didn't treat her like a victim of fate. When he suggested she visit the promenade on her own again, she laughed. But she did. One icy evening, she went staring at the skyline and wondering what her life might have looked like if she'd turned left instead of right that night on the expressway. Back in Sunset Park, Rafael's act of desperation had become his undoing. The next morning, police found him at home, sitting beside Lily's bed, as she finally slept, her breathing steady after the dose of medicine. They arrested him quietly, the way you handle someone who doesn't fight back. He didn't resist, because in his mind he'd already made peace with the only truth that mattered: his little girl was alive. The story spread fast. Local father charged in pharmacy robbery, the headline said, though none mentioned the toy gun, the unpaid bills, or the sound of a 5-year-old gasping for air. By the time Rafael appeared in front of Judge Marlowe, his life was already reduced to a case number and a stack of affidavits. But when she looked down from the bench that morning and saw his file injury foreclosure, unpaid hospital bills, something shifted. She saw more than another defendant. She saw the reflection of her own brokenness staring back. Both had been wounded by accidents, both abandoned by systems built to help them, and both had been waiting, one for mercy, the other for meaning. What no one knew then was that the story about to unfold wouldn't just test the limits of law. It would ask every person in that courtroom to decide what they believed about the possible. Before the gavel ever fell, fate had already drawn its line. Two people who had lost everything were about to discover that sometimes broken lives meet in the same place for a reason that has nothing to do with guilt and everything to do with grace. By the second day of the trial, the air inside courtroom 4B felt different, heavier, as though everyone there could sense that the ordinary rules didn't apply anymore. The jurors came in with that look people wear when they're pretending not to expect a miracle. Reporters filled the back row, whispering about the little girl with the flower. And behind the bench, Judge Eliza Marlowe sat still as stone, the wilted daisy from yesterday, lying in front of her, its stem bent but stubbornly green. Assistant District Attorney Daniel Pierce was determined to pull the case back to reality. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice steady, "sympathy doesn't change facts. The defendant entered a private business after hours with what appeared to be a weapon. Intent matters less than action. The law cannot bend for emotion." He paused, letting the words settle. "Because once we do that, the law stops protecting anyone." He believed it. He had to. Without order, his world didn't make sense. Defense attorney Maya Nguyen rose slowly, her nerves replaced by a quiet confidence that hadn't been there the day before. "The law," she said, "exists to protect people, but who protects them when the law forgets mercy?" Her voice trembled slightly, but the room listened. Mr. Ortiz didn't steal to harm anyone. He didn't even steal in the true sense. He left what he could pay. He begged for help. And when no one listened, he did what any parent would do when their child couldn't breathe. Maya stopped, glanced toward Lily, and lowered her tone. "If that's a crime, then maybe we need to redefine what justice really means." Eliza watched her closely. The young lawyer reminded her of herself years ago, idealistic, fierce, unafraid to believe in fairness, even when the world made it seem foolish. She wanted to agree with her. But her duty was to the law, not her heart. Still, something about the daisy on her bench made that distinction feel thinner than it used to. The prosecution called witnesses the pharmacist, the responding officer, a security analyst. Each one reinforced the facts. But when it came time for the defense, the facts started to feel smaller next to the human truth they carried. Raphael spoke quietly when he took the stand. "I didn't mean to scare anyone," he said. "My daughter couldn't breathe. I had no money, no help. I thought I could explain, but the man at the counter looked scared. I panicked. I just needed to save her." He looked down at his hands, the same ones that had built homes for other people, but couldn't keep his own family safe. "I left the money I had, $18.37. I thought maybe that made it okay. I was wrong, I guess." The room was silent. Even Pierce didn't press hard during cross-examination. There was nothing to be gained from crushing a man already broken. But it was Lily's voice, not her father's, that shifted everything. During a recess, she stood near her grandmother's side, watching the grown-ups argue over what love was worth in dollars and statutes. "They're all trying to decide who's right," she whispered. "But no one's asking what's good." When court resumed that afternoon, Eliza caught herself looking at the little girl again, the memory of that flower flickering in her mind. She told herself it was coincidence, the way warmth sometimes brings color back to petals. But deep down she knew it wasn't warmth, she'd seen it was life, and she didn't know what to do with that. Halfway through the afternoon session, Lily stood again, the same calm certainty in her small frame. "Judge Lady," she said. The bailiff started toward her, but Eliza lifted a hand to stop him. "Yes, Miss Ortiz." The child stepped forward, her shoes squeaking on the marble floor. "You still have the flower?" she asked. Eliza nodded slowly, then looked at it again. The judge turned her eyes toward the daisy. It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't dead either. Its petals had opened wider, and the faintest scent of spring lingered in the stale courtroom air. Eliza's breath caught. "What do you want me to see, Lily?" she asked. The little girl smiled as if explaining something simple. That sometimes what's alive doesn't follow rules. Sometimes it just decides to keep going. The courtroom murmured. Pierce objected. "Of course. Your Honor, this is completely inappropriate." But his voice cracked halfway through. The jurors weren't listening to him anymore. They were watching Lily, small and steady, holding the kind of faith most adults forget how to carry. At that moment, a news producer from Channel 8 sitting near the back whispered to her cameraman, "Are we filming history or losing our minds?" The cameraman didn't answer. He just kept the lens steady. Judge Marlowe felt the pulse in her temples. The rational part of her wanted to restore order, to tell everyone to sit, to remind them that faith doesn't belong in a courtroom. But her heart was louder now. It said, maybe the law was never meant to suffocate grace. She looked down at the daisy again. The petals trembled slightly, though no breeze touched it. "Miss Ortiz," she said softly, "you believe this flower means something." Lily nodded. "It means things can get better even when everyone says they can't." The judge exhaled slowly. "And you believe you can heal me?" "Not me," Lily said. "Love can." Those words landed like a gavel. They weren't loud, but they echoed through every person sitting there, including Eliza. She didn't know what she believed anymore, but she knew she wanted to see what happened next. The line between proof and faith had blurred so completely that it no longer mattered which side anyone stood on. What mattered was the truth that filled the room, a truth bigger than evidence, stronger than reason. A truth shaped like a daisy that refused to die. The courthouse was never meant for moments like this. It was built for verdicts and rules, for logic and order. But that afternoon, as the winter light slanted through the tall windows, something alive began to move through the room. Something that didn't belong to law or reason. It started when Lily Ortiz climbed the few steps to the witness stand without waiting to be called. She carried no papers, no testimony, only the kind of courage that comes from love, too big for fear. Judge Eliza Marlowe didn't stop her. She should have, but she didn't. The silence in the courtroom was unlike any she had ever known, not heavy or hostile, but expectant, almost reverent. The bailiff stood frozen by the door. Even the prosecutor, Daniel Pierce, lowered his pen. Everyone seemed to understand that what was about to happen would not fit inside a transcript. Lily looked up at the judge. "You said you don't believe in miracles," she said softly. "That's okay. Grown-ups forget how." The words landed gently, but they carried weight. Eliza opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again. For a moment she was no longer the judge. She was the woman who'd once stood on two strong legs and watched her world vanish in the blink of a drunk driver's headlights. Dr. Sunil Kapoor, sitting quietly in the gallery, shifted forward. He had treated Eliza through the long months of recovery, had seen her fight with a will most people never discover. Now, as he watched the little girl stand before her, his medical mind warred with the sense that something deeper was unfolding, something beyond physiology. The air itself felt different, dense and charged. "Can I come closer?" Lily asked. Her voice was calm, but her small hands trembled. Eliza nodded. The courtroom floor seemed to hum as the child crossed it. Every eye followed her. No one coughed, no one whispered. The sound of her shoes against the marble echoed like a heartbeat. When she reached the bench, she placed her hand on Eliza's small fingers against the cool skin of a woman who hadn't felt her legs in years. "Close your eyes," Lily whispered. "You don't have to believe. Just remember what it felt like when you did." Eliza's throat tightened. She wanted to protest, to remind everyone that this wasn't how justice worked, but the words wouldn't come. So she obeyed. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to remember the wind on her face, at the top of a trail in Colorado, the scent of pine, the weight of her boots on stone. She had been whole then, untouchable, alive. Somewhere behind her closed eyes, the memory sharpened, grew brighter, until it felt less like remembering and more like returning. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. One of the jurors gasped. Dr. Kapoor rose slowly to his feet. Beneath the bench, the toes of Eliza's shoes twitched barely, but undeniably. She felt it too, a faint warmth spreading upward, unfamiliar, but real. Her eyes flew open. "What's happening?" she whispered. Lily didn't answer. She was focused, palms resting lightly on the judge's knees, her face serene, as if listening to something no one else could hear. The silence deepened. Even the cameras from Channel 8 stopped whirring. Daniel Pierce's jaw tightened. His world was built on logic, and logic was crumbling in front of him. The court reporter's hands hovered uselessly over her keyboard. For once, there were no words. Eliza felt pressure, gentle but insistent, pushing through the numbness that had defined her for so long. It wasn't pain, it was possibility. Her body trembled as nerves long dormant flickered awake. When she tried to speak, her voice broke. "Lily," she said, "I can feel," and then stopped, overwhelmed by a rush of sensation she'd stopped dreaming about years ago. Tears filled her eyes before she realized she was crying. The daisy on her desk stood upright now, petals spread wide, glowing in the thin light. Someone in the back row whispered a prayer. Another just whispered, "My God." And then the impossible happened. Judge Eliza Marlowe, the woman who had ruled from a wheelchair for 3 years, slowly pushed her palms against the bench and rose. Not fully, not gracefully, but enough. Enough that the air left the room in one collective exhale. Dr. Kapoor moved toward her eyes, wide, his voice trembling. "Judge Marlowe, can you feel your legs?" She nodded, one hand gripping the bench for balance. "I can feel everything," she said. The courtroom broke. Some people cried openly, others clapped before remembering where they were. Even Pierce, who had spent a lifetime arguing facts, lowered his head and whispered, "What do we do now?" Eliza stood there shaking, not from fear, but from awe. She looked at Lily, who smiled up at her with the calm of someone who had simply kept a promise. "Told you," Lily said softly. "Love fixes things." In that moment, the courtroom was not a courtroom anymore. It was a church, a hospital, a home. The boundaries that usually divided people, titles, uniforms, beliefs, dissolved into something singular. For the first time, the room seemed to breathe as one. Every heart beating in unison, every mind asking the same silent question. What did we just witness? Judge Marlowe looked out at them all, the jurors, the lawyers, the cameras, the child, and said the only thing that made sense. Sometimes she whispered the truth doesn't need to make sense. Then she took her first full step, slow and trembling, as the entire room rose to its feet, not out of duty, but out of pure, wordless wonder. The morning after the miracle, the courthouse on Adams Street was no longer just a building. It was a shrine. People left flowers on the front steps, notepads with prayers tucked into the railing, children's drawings of daisies taped to the windows. By noon, satellite trucks lined the block. Headlines called it the Brooklyn Miracle. Some said it was divine, others said it was a hoax, but everyone said they'd never forget the look on Judge Eliza Marlowe's face when she stood for the first time in 3 years. Inside her chambers, Eliza sat quietly, hands folded around a cup of coffee gone cold. The cane resting beside her chair felt like a confession she wasn't ready to make public. Dr. Kapoor had examined her that morning. No nerve implants, no procedures, no logical reason. "Your scans show regeneration." "I can't explain," he'd said, shaking his head. Whatever happened in that courtroom, medicine will be arguing about it for years. She'd smiled faintly and replied, "Medicine won't be the only one." But while the city marveled, there was still a verdict to render. Rafael Ortiz remained in custody waiting for the same system that had failed him to decide whether grace could be measured in legal terms. The press called him a thief. The people called him a father. And in between those two versions of the truth, Eliza had to find the right words. When court resumed that Friday, the room was overflowing. There were TV crews pressed against the back wall, priests in collars, skeptics with notebooks. The jury had been dismissed. What was coming next was for the record, not for debate. Eliza entered to a standing ovation she hadn't asked for. She didn't want applause, she wanted peace. "Mr. Ortiz," she began, her voice steady, "this court has spent the last week wrestling with questions that reach far beyond law. You did by definition commit a crime, but this courtroom also witnessed something extraordinary, something that reminded us that mercy is not the enemy of justice." She paused, meeting his eyes. "The purpose of the law is to protect life, and you acted to save one. This court cannot ignore intent born of love." She leaned forward, every word deliberate. "Therefore, I am dismissing the felony charge. You will serve 200 hours of community service at the Mercy Health Clinic, helping families who face the same barriers you did. The record will show not guilt, but grace." The gavel came down softly, like punctuation instead of punishment. Rafael exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. His mother wept openly, and Lily, sitting beside her grandmother, smiled, like she already knew what the verdict would be. Afterward, reporters shouted questions. Was it faith science, a staged event? Eliza didn't answer any of them. "The court is adjourned," she said simply. But the lesson isn't. She exited through the side door, the sound of camera shutters chasing her like rain. Over the next weeks, the story rippled through the city. Churches called it proof. Atheists called it psychology. Politicians called it a moment of reflection. But beneath all the noise, real change began to grow in quiet corners. Daniel Pierce, the prosecutor who once swore by the letter of the law, proposed a pilot program called the Compassion Docket, giving nonviolent defendants access to counseling and rehabilitation instead of jail. The law, he said in a press conference, is supposed to serve people, not crush them. The Mercy Health Clinic, where Rafael now worked fixing broken chairs and repainting walls, expanded its hours after a flood of donations. A small brass plaque near the entrance read, "For every parent who refused to give up." Harold Levin, the pharmacist who'd first called the police, started a private fund to cover emergency prescriptions for families in need. It was never about money, he told a reporter. It was about remembering what matters before the paperwork does. For Eliza, change came slower, quieter. Her days were still long and filled with rulings, but something inside her had shifted. She didn't roll into court anymore, she walked. The first few weeks she used the cane for balance. After that, it became more of a reminder than a necessity. The wheelchair remained in her office, not as a relic, but as a promise never to forget the woman she had been, the one who had learned patience through pain. One evening, as winter began to soften into early spring, Eliza found herself back at Prospect Park. The city hummed around her, alive and ordinary again. Lily and Rafael met her near the fountain, a paper bag in the child's hands. "We brought you something," Lily said. Inside was a small potted rose, the petals a deep crimson. "Daisies are for hope," Lily explained. "Roses are for forever." Eliza smiled, brushing a tear from her cheek. Then, I'll keep this one alive as long as I can. They sat on the bench watching the sunset burn over the skyline. Raphael spoke quietly. I don't know what happened in that courtroom, Judge. I don't know why you stood or why my daughter can do what she does. But I do know this. I went in believing the world had turned its back on us, and I walked out believing it hadn't. Eliza nodded. Maybe that's the real miracle, she said, that we all remembered how to care. Months later, long after the cameras had gone and the headlines faded, the city kept changing in small human ways. A juror volunteered at a food pantry. A young clerk applied to law school to become a public defender. A nurse at Mercy Health painted daisies on the hallway walls. None of it made the news, but each act carried the echo of that moment when a room full of strangers had believed in something impossible together. In her office, Judge Marlowe kept the daisy from that day pressed beneath glass. It had long since dried, its color gone, but she swore it still smelled faintly of sunlight. When new clerks asked about it, she never told the full story. She'd just smile and say, "It reminds me that love isn't evidence, but it's proof enough." And in Brooklyn, where miracles tend to hide in the everyday, that was enough. In the end, what began as a courtroom case about a desperate father and a stolen box of medicine became something far greater, a story about the collision between law faith and the human heart. Judge Eliza Marlowe, a woman once defined by discipline and pain, discovered that the power to heal doesn't always belong to doctors or miracles. Sometimes it belongs to the willingness to believe again. Rafael Ortiz, a man who thought he'd lost everything, found redemption not in acquittal, but in a world that finally saw him as more than his mistakes. And little Lily, with her unwavering innocence, reminded everyone that love, when pure and fearless, can rewrite the rules of even the hardest hearts. The city moved on as cities do, but for those who witnessed it that day in courtroom 4B never truly ended. It lived on in quiet gestures. The pharmacist who learned compassion before protocol. The prosecutor who chose mercy over pride. The judge who walked again, but carried humility with each step. What happened wasn't about supernatural proof. It was about what happens when people stop protecting their pain and start protecting each other. Eliza often said later that Lily didn't just heal her legs, she healed her vision. For years she'd seen the law as a shield. That day she understood it could also be a bridge. Raphael rebuilt his life not through forgiveness, but through service, using his hands once more to repair what others had given up on. And Lily grew up believing that miracles aren't meant to prove God, they're meant to remind us that love still works. The lesson buried in this story isn't about walking again or defying science. It's about how love and compassion can move the immovable. Every person has a courtroom inside them, a place where reason argues with faith, where fear challenges hope. And sometimes all it takes to tip the scales is a small voice saying, "It's okay to believe again." We live in a time when the world feels divided, when laws and opinions shout louder than kindness. But stories like this remind us that what truly holds us together isn't proof or punishment, it's empathy. It's the courage to look at someone else's pain and decide to care anyway. If you carry anything from this story into your own life, let it be this. The smallest act of love, the simplest gesture of compassion can ripple further than you'll ever see. And if this story moved you, inspired you, or made you pause even for a second to think about what truly matters, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Your support gives us the strength to keep telling stories that remind the world that kindness, hope, and humanity still matter. Because somewhere out there, another story like this is waiting to be told, and we want you to be here when it happens.